Welcome to Trauma-Informed Parenting. I'm your host, Kathleen Guire. Each week we dive in and learn about the effects of trauma and navigating neurodiversity. I'm a mother of 7, 4 through adoption, former National Parent of the Year, author, teacher, and speaker who is obsessed with helping others become trauma-informed. I know what it's like to raise kiddos with a trauma history and neurodiversity. I used to feel as if I were the only one struggling, and because I felt that way, I isolated myself. I don't want you to feel alone in your parenting journey, so grab a cup of coffee and join me for Trauma-Informed Parenting, a coffee break podcast. What does the Bible say about healing from trauma? Is there hope? Maybe you're asking that right now. Let me assure you, there is hope. The very reason Jesus came to earth was to heal the brokenhearted and to set the captive, spiritual and physical, free. Today, I want to talk about 3 biblical promises about recovering from trauma in relation to that. And before I start, I'm going to get up on my soapbox for a minute. When I approach churches and schools and other people about becoming trauma-informed, I often get the door, metaphorically, slammed in my face. We don't need that here. We're not dealing with trauma here. Well, let me just say, if you are on planet Earth, you have some sort of trauma history. And we do need trauma-informed training in our churches, in our schools. We need that so that people can heal, so they can feel loved and accepted. Okay, stepping down off my soapbox for a minute. Pretty much this whole podcast episode will be on a soapbox. Okay, when it comes to healing from trauma, the first step is acknowledging the trauma. And that's what I see on a daily basis, that people don't want to acknowledge that they have experienced trauma or that their kiddos have. The reasons I start with that statement in my little soapbox thing is because many people normalize their trauma. And I did a whole podcast on that. I will link it in the show notes, including churches. So when trauma is normalized, there is a lot of sweeping it under the rug. Plus, it can lead to an unhealthy family culture and patterns of chaos wherever we are. We see it, right? When we acknowledge the trauma, whether it is caused by one of the 6 risk factors, I'll link that, or due to being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world, we can begin to heal. Unfortunately, there is no magic cure for trauma healing. No pill, no easy fix. In fact, sometimes I see parents and people running from doctor to doctor seeking this cure when trauma is really the root of the problem. I'm not saying you shouldn't go to the doctor or seek help. Just don't put all of your hope in a pill. So what does the Bible say about healing from trauma? Is there hope? Maybe that's what you're asking right now. Or do you even realize that the Bible talks about it? That's what I run into at churches sometimes. They're like, we don't need that. That's not a thing here. But the Bible does talk about trauma. And let me assure you, there is hope. The very reason Jesus came to earth was to heal the brokenhearted and set the captive, spiritual and physical, free. He wanted us to be in relationship with the Father, whole and healed, not broken. Now, I'm using Isaiah 61 as the framework for this podcast because it is the framework for all I do and what I call my ministry, which is business ministry put together. Isaiah 61:1 is the beginning of the summary of what Jesus came to earth to do. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed and qualified me to preach the gospel of good tidings to the meek, the poor, and afflicted. He has sent me to bind up and heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the physical and spiritual captives, and the opening of the prison and of the eyes to those who are bound. Now, I am going to take that scripture and I'm going to pull out 3 promises from the chapter, Isaiah 61. So if you've never read that chapter before, I suggest you do it. It is really full of wonderful promises for healing. So the first promise I would like to talk about is freedom. The Bible promises freedom. Jesus proclaims it. We must accept it. This begins with acknowledging the truth of what has happened to us or who we are. When I say freedom, I'm not saying that God is going to deliver your kids or you from your neurodivergencies. Those can be gifts, but that's a different podcast. Freedom means that that door to the prison is open. It says the opening of the prison. The opening of the prison. You can step forth into freedom. As Jesus says in John 5 to the man at the pool of Bethesda, do you want to get well? We have to want to get well. This will look different for each of us. Well may mean that at family events, you provide kiddos with safe foods, or bring noise-reducing headphones, or use a sensory swing when needed. Often people mistake well for the same as everyone else. Like, take that word well. I want to get well. And sometimes people think that it means I want to be the same as everyone else. That is just not the way it works. And that's not well. So if you acknowledge that truth, that you're well, your freedom will look different than somebody else's, then you can begin to make progress. Trauma lies about us and keeps us in a prison. If you want to know more about how trauma affects us, read what are the 6 risk factors indicating trauma, and I have that linked in the show notes. So the second thing promised is joy, consolation. The Bible says that Jesus will give us the garment of praise instead of a heavy, burdened, and failing spirit. Some say beauty for ashes. What does that mean? When we have a burdened, failing spirit, when we have something that's pressing down on us all the time, on our chest, and we feel heavy, we feel overwhelmed, we feel like we can't function, that's a burdened, failing spirit. And we can't enjoy our lives. We can't enjoy our children. Our children can't enjoy their lives. Trauma gives us a burden. Trauma gives our children a burden. And it's often too heavy for them to carry. Well, it is too heavy for them to carry. It's too heavy for us to carry. But Jesus takes that and he gives us joy. Now, this seems over spiritual when it comes to a 4-year-old who can't regulate, and the frequency and severity of his meltdowns creates chaos in the home, or you can't leave the home. How do we get here from this theoretical stuff this theology to joy. Honestly, there is not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to practices that help. But there are principles, and there's a framework that you can follow. And when you follow the framework, you can find some things that work for your kiddo. You can create a family culture that works for your family, and soon you'll have those pinpricks of joy that grow. And I can remember, like, one of the resources I have are the instead of tips. It's 8 tips to use instead of traditional parenting. And when I started applying some of those in my own home, for example, one of them is a redo. And when I would give my youngest that opportunity, whenever he was being very snarky or he did something wrong, and I would give him a redo. Let's try that again. And then he would respond with a Darth Vader voice and say, I'm sorry, or, I won't do that again. That sort of thing. That was a pinprick of joy that, like, he was getting it. He was beginning to catch on, and I was beginning to parent without the lengthy lectures, which is another one of the tips, is to use as few words as possible. And so these are things that, you take that theology and you're like, okay, I want that joy. I want that freedom, which means that we have to start doing things differently. As I mentioned just a minute ago, Jesus says to the man at the pool of Bethesda, do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? Which is really was, as I studied that particular history of this man, he was there for 38 years waiting for someone to put him near the water so that when the angel came to stir up the water, he would be able to be healed. And that's what he told Jesus, like, I have no one to put me in the water. We don't have someone to put us in the water. We have to put ourselves in the water, metaphorically. We have to do the work. That prison door is open. We have to begin to change the way that we view our parenting. We have to change the way that we believe kids should be parented and start instituting different tools in our parenting so that we can have joy. So that we can have joy in our home, because the meltdowns will never completely go away. Mine have never completely gone away, but we can reduce the frequency and the severity, and we can find those pinpricks of joy. It's just, I just think about making, I always like to give these word pictures. Like, have you ever done paper mache where you take a balloon and you put the paper, you dip it into the flour mixture with water, and then you put it on the balloon, you let it harden, and then you pop the balloon, okay? So if you you put a little light in there before you make it, and then you start taking a little push pin, and you start popping through, and those little parts of light will just start streaming out, and you just keep poking at it till you have more than a pinprick. Okay, getting off on the word pictures there. Going down a rabbit hole. Number 3, a double portion. So what does that mean? Instead of your former shame, you'll have double. Double whatever you lost to shame. That's a promise. Double whatever you lost to the years of trauma you endured. Double to whatever your children lost to the years of trauma that they endured. Double for the taunts and torment you went through for being different. Okay? Double. And the thing is, you have to believe and accept this first. This goes for you too, parent. You can reparent yourself. You can find ways to infuse joy into your day. You can create an environment in your home that suits you and your family. I'm going to go back to the well thing. If you think that well means like everybody else, then you're going to stay stuck. But if you want to move to this double portion and you're reparenting yourself and you're beginning to heal and you are parenting your children in the way that you wish that you were parented, then you are going to begin to have that double portion. You have to decide what that looks like for you. You can create that environment in your home that suits you and your family. And when you go out in public, when you leave the home, you can be that protector for your child. It's okay. You know, I grew up in a time period where if you met somebody at the grocery store that your parents knew, there was a certain protocol that you had to follow. And I remember one of the things that I really struggled with when I was young was my mom would take us on these little work dates when she was working for a newspaper. We'd go with her and do a couple things for the newspaper, and she'd take us out to lunch. I literally could not order food for myself. It was so overwhelming. So I would whisper to my mom what I wanted, and she would turn around and say, she wants, that is totally okay. You're allowed to do that. If you think well means that your child who is overstimulated, overwhelmed, overtaxed, can't regulate, has to order their food, then you're going to stay stuck. Can I order my food now? Yes, I can. I needed that at that time. I needed that to feel safe because of my early childhood trauma. And also, when I finally reframed my beliefs that the trauma happened to me, it wasn't me, I made sense of and peace with my past. I learned the science. I applied the science. I began to take the reins of parenting. And you can do that. Take the reins of parenting. You are the parent. You are in charge. You are in charge of how things go. I'm not saying that you're going to be militant and march around the house and say, I'm in charge. What I'm saying is creating that environment in your home, meeting the needs of your child the way that they need to be met. I mentioned earlier, the sensory swing. I have a hook for a swing in my bedroom. So those sorts of things. A weighted blanket, noise-reducing headphones, a quiet space for your kids to go, time for them to just de-stress after you've been on an outing, giving them a day in between outings for them to recover. And if that is not what the culture says is well, then that's okay. You do what is well for you. And when you answer that question for yourself, do I want to get well? Yes, I do. I want to get well. Therefore, I'm going to take the reins and parent my kids. And if you work in a church, since I started with that, if you work with kids that have a trauma history, and maybe you teach Sunday school or something like that, and you know some of their stories, not that you're sharing it, but you know some of their stories, then make being together not about the behavior. I've talked about that on the podcast before. We often, constantly, because my kids couldn't regulate at church, it was all about the behavior. I am not saying that you need to let your children climb up in the ceiling at church, true story. But what I'm saying is every time they speak out of turn, every time they're wiggly and they can't sit still, those are not important. Those are not important. Maybe you get some, yoga balls for them to sit on. Or, make your church sensory friendly. Okay? I don't want to go too far into that, but all right, moving on. Take the long road to healing. I know. We all want instant. And I wish that I could tell you that listening to this podcast is all you need to do and you'll be on your way. I will be the first to say that the road to healing is long. Okay, think of this information that I'm giving you today as a seed. It's a seed. Let it fall in the good soil. Remember the parable of the sower? It's like there was rocky seed and, well, I'm just going to mention the good soil because I want you to remember that one. I'm not going to go over the whole parable. Let it fall on good soil. Nourish it, water it, think about it, talk about it to someone. If you need to, listen to this more than once. Read the show notes because it's basically just an article. Get the resources I suggest. Study and let the truth begin to work. And then you will feel compelled to make the changes. You'll feel like, you know what? I can do this with God's help. He made these promises. I'm going to believe the promises, but I want to get well, so I'm going to do the work. Often what I see in parents is they want to get well. They want their family dynamic. I just tried to put two words together. Their family dynamic to be healed and healthy. So they ask for prayer, and that is wonderful. You need to ask for prayer. It's very important. We need to be praying for ourselves, for our children every day. But then they wait. And then everything stays the same. And they stay the same. And when I was doing more counseling one-on-one, I'm not going to pick on anybody because I've been there. I'm just going to give a very general example. Often people would come back to the next counseling session and I would say, okay, I gave you these articles to read or these worksheets to fill out. Let's start with those. Oh, we didn't do that. We didn't do that. Well, you have to do the work. If you want to move forward, you have to do the work. And even with the man at the pool of Bethesda, when Jesus said, do you want to get well? And then he's like, I've been laying here for 38 years, and then Jesus said, take up your mat and walk. Like, do the work. Do the work. And then later, when he saw him in the temple, he said, look, this is wonderful. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. You are well. Stop sinning or something worse will come upon you. So I struggled with that particular conversation that Jesus had. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Well, the truth is we can read, learn, listen, get the information, and we take the initial first step. But then just because we're humans, we fall back into old patterns. We're like, I tried that for 2 days, it didn't work. And then we feel worse than we did before. We go back to those old habits, and because we have the knowledge that there are these promises for freedom, for joy, for a double portion, now you know that, then you will feel worse if you go back to old habits, old ways of thinking, old ways of doing. And I think that's what Jesus meant. I don't know. I'm not a theologian. Okay, moving on. So like I said, study and let the truth begin to do the work. Just realize this. This often means our lives will look very different from everyone else's lives. We may feel odd or as if we stand out. I know that I often do because of the way that I live. And that's okay. I'd rather be the odd girl out than the one under stress and the shame of trying to be the same. Now, what do I mean by that, being the odd girl out? Well, I mentioned briefly before, like if you take your kiddos who have a trauma history or are neurodivergent to an outing, maybe even at church, since I keep bringing up church. And you know that when you get home, your kiddos are melting down and they need time to recover. And the next day, there is something else going on at the church that people want you to volunteer for, or with the soccer team or something else. And you feel, or you know, your kids need a day to recover, for their nervous systems to regulate, for their sensory overwhelm to decrease. And you say to whomever is in charge of that, we can't come. You might be the odd parent out because, oh, you're not committed. We're all committed to this. You need to do this. You have to be here. I did it yesterday. I'm doing it today. No. I would rather be the odd girl out. And I will be perfectly honest with you, because I am self-diagnosed on the spectrum. I haven't had an official diagnosis, but I know. There are often times where I have done so many events just personally myself in a row that when it comes to going to church on Sunday morning, I'll either go and slip out early just because I am in overwhelm that I can't do the chatting afterward. Or sometimes I just have to skip it altogether and watch something online. So if I'm like that, which I know, your kiddos may even not be able to voice or understand what their own body is telling them. And I think that just going back to the well, getting well doesn't mean what everybody else is doing. And I know I'm hammering in that point, and it's so important. But as parents, it's important for us to build the walls for our children that they cannot build themselves. And I want to read you the scripture. And they shall rebuild the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former desolations and renew the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. Now that is also from Isaiah 61. So we have to, I'm just going to be practical. I'm just going to take out of that scripture, even though they're talking about the actual ancient ruins, we can rebuild. I love the book of Nehemiah. If you haven't read it in a while, that's a great one. You know, the families that are rebuilding the wall with one hand and they have their sword in the other, like, I am going to protect my family and build the wall around my family. That's getting well. Okay? All right. I know I'm going off on all sorts of tangents, but I'm going to finish up on this. With this, a bonus point. Healing doesn't just happen. Just like I said, I was talking about rebuilding. There's going to have to be some rebuilding on our part. We must take some time to reconstruct all the broken parts of our family. Again, Jesus says to the man who laid for 38 years at the pool of Bethesda, and I always emphasize that because I always feel like that was me. Do you want to get well? What this means for us is leaving generational trauma, unrealistic expectations, this is the way it always was mentalities, and limiting beliefs behind. Let me paint a picture both ways. The way it always was, or do we want the way it can be? The reason I'm going into this is because you have parts of your family culture that's just the way they were. Me too. But have you ever thought about this? Do you want to continue them into your family patterns and your culture? Do you have the same system of government in your family that you were brought up in? Just because that's just the way it was. And are you raising your children the same way that you were raised? Not to put your parents under the bus, but maybe they just didn't have the information. Like my parents, it was not even on their radar that I was autistic. It's just that there wasn't that much information, or they weren't looking into that. So that's okay. But having the choice now, do you want to just say, I'm raising my kids exactly the same way that my parents raised me, but you have all this unresolved trauma. You want the freedom. You want the joy. You want the double portion. I've had some major pivots in my family because of major life changes. And my early life was traumatized by abuse, alcoholism, not me. I wasn't a toddler drinker. And eventually divorce. So there was a major pivot there where my mom took all of us and we moved away and we started again. Not throwing my dad under the bus. He had his issues. So when we started fresh, she got remarried to an Army colonel, so my life changed drastically. I went from not knowing how my dad was going to react, if he was going to be mad that day, if something I did that day was going to cause him to overreact the next day. That's just normal for an alcoholic. So if that, if you've struggled with that in your own personal life, I'm not judging you. I'm just trying to paint a picture that you can make a decision to live differently. Okay? If you were raised in a chaotic environment, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But you can make a change. You can pivot. You can say, I want to get well. I want those promises. I want freedom. I want joy. I want a double portion for myself, for my kiddos, for my whole family. Now, if you need something, a resource to help you get started, I have linked in the show notes how to have peace when your kids are in chaos. It's a free guide. It's parenting that actually works. You can learn the science, apply the science, change the behaviors, and have more peace. So if you grab your copy of that on traumainformedparenting.com, and then you hop over to my YouTube channel, Trauma Informed Parenting, you can find a playlist that will help you work through that free guide. And I have some other, as I finish up, I have some other resources linked. Things that I kind of mentioned. 3 tips on resetting your family culture. 5 habits every trauma-informed parent needs to practice. 3 tips to begin healing from trauma while parenting. Because we can't just quit our day job, can we? We still have to parent. If you're like, right now, you're like, I realize that I experienced some trauma in my childhood. Now, can I just push pause on parenting? No, you can't. But you can begin healing from trauma while you're parenting at the same time. And the other one that I mentioned, what are the 6 risk factors indicating trauma? I have that linked. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next week. Bye. If you're struggling with accepting and applying the 3 biblical promises about recovering from trauma, then I suggest you grab a copy of my book, A Positive Adoption Story, The Door from Theology to Reality. And listen, I get it. That was me. That's why the title of my book is The Door from Theology to Reality, because theology is just having it in your head, right? And I had these promises in my head for a long time before I started believing them and applying them to my life. So what's my book about? It's a memoir. It's this story of me, a girl born into a family who believed in justice and equality, but couldn't quite find it for themselves. Instead, my family followed the course of humanism and it fell apart. I'm a girl that had a traumatic beginning, reaping the consequences of other people's life choices. But that's where my heart from adoption grew out of my difficult beginning. And in my book, I weave a patchwork quilt narrative from my healing, my childhood, and my children's adoption. One Amazon review says, "I could not put this book down. The author weaves her history of trauma with the adoption of her children who had experienced trauma. While not minimalizing the challenge, she gives hope for healing and fulfilling lives." Listen, you can claim and live the biblical promises for healing from trauma. I'm proof. Grab a copy of A Positive Adoption Story on traumainformedparenting.com/shop. Start claiming those promises as your own. Thanks for listening to Trauma Informed Parenting. Make sure you rate and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. New episodes are dropping each Wednesday, so brew that coffee, pull up a chair, and let's learn together. If you're looking for some more encouragement as well as resources, hop on over to traumainformedparenting.com.